Okay, picking up where we left off in the last video. So we talked a little bit about Bootstrap, using the classes in the correct order, class container, class row, class column. And just to remind you, the app we want to build is basically going to be the left column of restaurants and a right column of recipes. So more specifically, I want us to be able to click on a restaurant here in the left column, and I want to show the recipes that belong to that restaurant. So one restaurant is going to have a list of recipes, and how we'll create that map between those two collections is going to be using the magic _ID field. So each restaurant has one of these IDs, and so every recipe, so if we do like recipe dot, in this case we will call it the owner, well, we'll say created by, because basically each restaurant creates certain recipes. So the recipe dot created by field will be equal to this crazy ID of the restaurant that it belongs to. So that's how we're going to map the two things together. So let's take a look at that in practice. So the first thing we should get going is we should just build our list of restaurants out. So we're doing a 2-column layout, 50-50. Right now we have a 3-column layout. So I'm going to delete one of these column elements. And now I want to go 50-50. And since it's a 12-column layout, we'll do 6 and 6. Excellent. So now we can see 50-50. And we'll go ahead and make this like an H3 right here. And we'll say restaurants on the left. And then we'll make this an H3. And we will say recipes on the right. Boom. Now we got restaurants and recipes. So let's go ahead and make our list of restaurants first. So the first thing we should do is we should put a button in here that says create restaurant. Now, something we'll realize is that this button, we aren't using any styles on it currently. We don't have a class equals something in here. So if we want to find out which class to use to make this button look a little bit better, let's pull up our Bootswatch theme. And let's say I just want to use this block level button right here. I'll click on the code for that, and you can see here is the chunk of HTML. So I'm actually going to copy that, and we'll put it in here. And I'm going to format it so that it's not all in one line. And you will notice two things. First of all, they're using an A tag with an href. So this is not, they aren't using the button element, they're using the link element, but then using the button styles to make it look like a button, right? If you recall from previous class discussions, every single HTML element on a page is basically just a box, and they can all use the same styles to look in any certain way. So a button element, you don't necessarily have to use a button element to create something that looks like a button. You could just use an A tag like they did here. And if we look at our app, we'll see that works just fine. The one challenge with that, though, is, well, I shouldn't really say a challenge with that, but in this case, we don't really want to link to something, so we don't really need this href tag. And it doesn't really need to be an A. It makes more sense for us to actually use a button element, because we're just trying to create a button here. So we'll switch that to a button, and it should look the exact same. Cool. So now we need to subscribe to the button event. So let's go over here into our template, and let's listen to the click button event. And when they click a button, we want to add a restaurant to the restaurants collection. So we haven't defined a restaurants collection yet, so let's go ahead and do that now. So I'll go up here outside of meteor.isClient. We'll say restaurants equals new mongo.collection. Let's say restaurants. Excellent. And in this case, we'll just give a restaurant a name. It doesn't need anything more than that. So we'll do restaurants.insert, and then we'll add our restaurant in. We'll call it like the Green Pig. And now, whenever they click on this button, it should insert a new restaurant into our restaurants collection. So if what I just did was kind of fast or a little bit too confusing, definitely go back to an older collection video and rewatch it so that you can understand what's happening here. Now, maybe we don't want to actually have the name always say the Green Pig. We want to be able to dynamically set the name of the restaurant. So to do that, we are going to need an input field. So let's go here. We'll scroll down. And you can see there's some different inputs here in this form. So I'll open this up. And so there's a bunch of different examples, but the one I'm going to grab is I want to grab the large input. So I just need this div, chunk of HTML right there. Come back into my app. So now you can see we can have an input right there. I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this label because that's what is creating this large input section right here. And we don't need that because we already have this like restaurants thing up top. So I'll just delete this label HTML. Cool. So now when we type something and we click the button, we need to somehow get reference to this HTML element right here and grab the value off of it. So to do that, we need to work with the event object. So the event object is a parameter that's automatically included on any event function. And we can use that to basically traverse the DOM and grab information off of different HTML elements and then do stuff with that information. So 1 second while I pull it up. And let's go ahead and look at what is available to us on our event object, just so that we can really drive this home. So why don't we actually, we'll comment this out for now, so we don't want to insert stuff into our restaurants quite yet. And let's just do console.log event. So basically when they click the button, we'll print out the event object so we can just take a look at what that looks like. So we're here in our app, make sure that's up to date. And now I'm going to do inspect element and pull up the console. And let me click on this button. Okay, so now we see this jQuery event object. So if we expand it here, there's a ton of different fields. Typically what we'll look at though is this target field. So target is whatever object had the event get triggered on it. So in this case, you can see that it's this button, right? It's actually highlighting it when I mouse over that, which is pretty cool. Now, unfortunately, there's not really an easy way for us to get from this button target to this DOM element. And the reason for that is because of we haven't really used the form syntax correctly. So a form is what we're creating right here. So you can see, we've got this input class, we've got this form group, but there's what we want is effectively, we want the current event to be triggered for this form that's being created. So in order to do that, we could actually completely get rid of creating our button here. So one way we could trigger the form event is actually just by hitting enter. So if I type something, hit enter, that would normally trigger the form event. So hang on with me here for a second. What we need to do is we basically, let me expand that. Basically, we want to no longer listen to the click button event, and we want to listen to the event that gets fired when they press enter on this form. So in order to do that, we should be able to just listen to the submit event that's happening on this div right here. So let's start off by deleting our button. We don't need that anymore. And now let's change our selector from click button to submit, and then we'll say dot form group. There's kind of some new syntax here. So just as a refresher, every event selector that you use has two components. The first piece is what event you're listening to. So that could be like a submit, a click, a mouse over. And the second component is what DOM element are you listening to that event on. So before we just said button, and that meant basically whenever we just clicked on any sort of button element. If you use a dot, that means you're selecting the element by the class. And if you use a hash, you can select something by an ID. So if I said ID Wesley, then we could have selected that by saying hash Wesley. So there's kind of a couple different ways we can select which DOM element we want to listen to the event on. We'll just go back to this, and let me delete that. And so now, when they press enter, we should see, let's change this right here. We should see an alert saying you hit enter. So let's give this a try. Okay, not quite. I think I know why. There we go. So before I had, from Bootswatch, I copied the div, this as a div. You can only get access to this submit event if you're actually using the form element. So in this case, we would need to use the form element. So typically speaking, whenever you are going to have text that you're inputting into your app, use the form element and then use these input elements in order to create the fields where you type stuff out. So now when I type something and hit enter, you can see it says, you hit enter. So I know that was a lot right there, and that was definitely confusing. So if that confused you, absolutely rewind the video and watch that a second time. So going back to what we were doing, we want to add a restaurant, and then we want the name to be the value from the form, right? Which is this thing right here. And we're going to get access to this string, whatever they're putting into our input, through this event parameter. So to get there, we are going to say event dot target. So the target, that's whatever it's coming from. So in this case, it's actually this element right here. Then we can say dot text dot value. So this is the name of the restaurant that they currently typed in to this field right here. And the way I was able to select that again was, so I used the event parameter, the target is this form, and then I said dot text. Dot text is specifically referring to the name of the input that we want to reference. So currently we don't have a name on this input field. So let's go ahead and add that attribute. So we'll say name equals text. And that's still a little bit confusing. So let's change this from text to restaurant name. And so now over here I should be able to say restaurant name and then get the value off of that. I think that'll work. So just to reiterate what we're doing, we have the event. We then get its target, which is this form. Then we look at which input we want, which is this input name equals restaurant name. And then we're taking the value, which is the current string that they've typed in. So there's a lot there. So I'm going to comment out our restaurant code again, just because I don't want to really mess with that quite yet. And let's actually log this out. Actually, we can just use an alert because that'll be clear to demonstrate. Let's just do an alert. And we should be able to, when they hit enter, we should see the text that they just typed in alerted. So I type this in, hit enter, there it is. So you can see that the text from right here has been alerted. And now something you'll probably notice is that when we did that, it automatically clears the text after the event fires for us as well, which is nice. So now from in here, let's uncomment our restaurants.insert. And we should just basically just take this line of code that gives us the value that they've typed in for this form, and we'll put it right here in the name slot. And so now, every time they add another restaurant, so we'll say like my store, we hit enter, it should add a new restaurant. However, you'll notice we're not actually doing anything to show our restaurants currently in our app. So below this form, I want to have a list of the current restaurants that we're using. So to do that, we will need an each block. So I'll come here below the form. We'll do like each for each value in restaurants. And then we will close this. Now, if we want this to look nice, let's go back to Bootswatch and let's actually find the list items. They're in here somewhere. So here we go. Here's an example. So here are like different list groups. So these are some different ways to make our items look nice in a list. So I'm just going to look at this one, and we are going to copy this UL. And the piece of the UL that we want to repeat is the LI. So this is the chunk of code that we'll do for each restaurant. Sorry, the chunk of HTML that we'll do for each restaurant. So now to do that, we only need one of them, right? Because we're repeating it. So I'll go ahead and delete those other two LIs. And you'll also notice that the way Bootswatch has it set up, there's this little badge thing on the right here. We will use that to show how many recipes our current restaurant owns. But for now, we're just going to leave it static, and I'll go back to and we'll update this field in a later video. So let me take this LI. And so since we're looping, right, we're going to put the LI inside of the each. And then the UL, we actually want to put outside of the each block. The reason for that is because we don't want to repeat the UL each time, right? We only want a single parent UL to wrap each of the LIs, and the LI is the piece that will repeat multiple times. And now we then want to show the name of the restaurant. So here we've just got some boilerplate text. So let's fill that in, and we'll do this.name. So if you remember from the previous video, this is the keyword representing the current item in the collection that we're looking at when we do this repeat. And the .name field is the field we want to access over here that we got from our form. So the only thing we don't have done now is we need to expose our restaurant collection through a helper so that it will be available to us in our HTML. So let me come in here into this helper. And since here I said restaurants, that's what we need to call our helper. So we'll do restaurants, create a function. And from in here, we'll just return restaurants.find. And that will just return all the restaurants for us. And if we come back to our app, you can see right here is my store, which we just created. So let's add another one, call it like the Green Pig. It's another restaurant. And now you can see that the Green Pig has been added to this list. Now, something you may have noticed is that when you add a new restaurant, so if I say my restaurant here, the whole page is refreshing. We've got some weird stuff added up here into our URL. I'll go ahead and just zoom in on that. So we got some crazy stuff that got added up here in our URL. That's because of how the default way forms behave. So forms were really built before cool things like Meteor existed. And so a form is typically trying to redirect you to a whole other page, right? And that's why when we're creating, even though our code works, every time we create a new restaurant, the whole page is still reloading and flickering on us. So we'll do that one more time. It'll be like other store, and I hit enter, and the whole page kind of flickers for a second because it's trying to route us to this new URL. So if we want to get rid of that functionality, that's called default functionality. So you can override default functionality inside of any event by just saying return false. And at that point, you've disabled that weird functionality that's happening. So we'll go back into our app and we'll just delete this weird thing. So let's go back to localhost 3000. And now if I should say, we'll do like Cafe Rio, you'll notice it just immediately added it to our list of items here, and there was no weird screen refresh that was occurring. So just to recap what we did in this video, we created a 2-column layout using Bootstrap. We then created a form, and we used the UL with some LIs to show each one of the restaurants that we created. From there, we subscribed to the enter event. So when they hit the enter key on their keyboard in this form, we subscribe to that event. Over here in our events, and when they hit enter, we then use this new event parameter to traverse our DOM and get access to whatever text they had put in this spot right here, such as Cafe Rio or whatever else they've typed. And then we created a new restaurant item in the collections with that information. And then finally, we expose that list of restaurants by creating a helper function here called restaurants, which is what we're looping over with our each block.